have a lot of agreement and a lot of disagreement, as you would expect. But let me just start with Tuti. It seems to me that you believe that Iran has no real ambition to get nukes because you don't think nukes buy you very much. In my story, it's ambition plus the ability to get the bomb that really matters. And I focused a lot of attention on ability. You seem to believe that Iran doesn't have the ambition, and it shouldn't have the ambition because nuclear weapons, again, don't provide much benefit. In other words, the Iranians can rely on their conventional deterrent, you said, to deter both the Israelis and the Americans. And when I listen to you talk, I think you and I have a very different view of the utility of nuclear weapons, right? You're in effect saying, to me anyway, it seems to me, that nuclear weapons make no sense, and these 9 nuclear weapon states in the system are crazy having nuclear weapons. Why should the United States have nuclear weapons? They don't buy us very much, especially when you think about our conventional deterrent, right? We are incredibly powerful at the conventional level. So why do we need nuclear weapons, right? And I sort of say to myself, if Tuti were the leader of some country in the world that was in a dangerous neighborhood, and she had a simple choice, she could easily get nuclear weapons or just not have them. Even if she could easily get them, she wouldn't get them because they just don't buy you very much. Whereas John, his view is if you live in a dangerous neighborhood, you want the ultimate deterrent. So I would appreciate it if you would just sort of expound on what I'm positing here to determine just how you and I differ from each other. Then with regard to Mahsa, 2 very quick questions. Once the sanction regime ends, Iran goes back into the JCPOA, the sanctions regime ends, 4 or 5 years down the road, let's say the Iranians misbehave. Do you seriously think we can bring sanctions back? I'm curious what you think of that. Second, with regard to the military option, I mean, I like your point, can Iran develop the bomb before we attack it? Do you seriously think the United States, given all the trouble in Ukraine, given its history of lost wars in the greater Middle East, and given the China threat, that the United States is likely to start a war, and it would involve starting a war with Iran if it was going to get the bomb, when we would know that in the end, they were going to get the bomb anyway. They were going to be mad as hornets. And in some future crisis, say between Iran and Israel, this would be a potentially disastrous situation. So I just, appreciate you clarifying for me how you think about those 2 issues.
Okay, I'll try to respond. I'm aware that what I said might have sounded a bit naive. I mean, I'm aware that there are 9 nuclear weapons states and many allies in Europe and in Japan who firmly believe that they need nuclear weapons to ensure security. But I just think that I think I'm repeating some previous arguments here, but I mean, applying this logic, if every country would apply this logic, every country would have nuclear weapons, and I think it wouldn't make anyone safer. And looking at it from the Iranian perspective, I don't think it necessarily serves Iran's interests because it's there. Okay, there is Israel in the region who has nuclear weapons, but Israel hasn't really threatened Iran with nuclear weapons. I mean, it's threatened Iran with preventive strikes, and for the reasons that I tried to list, I think for Iran, it would actually be better off without nuclear weapons because, okay, in general, they're thought to create deterrence, but yeah, there are a lot of risks involved as well. Things can go wrong, and when Saudi Arabia gets its own nuclear weapons, I mean, then the stakes gets much higher in conflicts. And of course, if we assume that everybody's a rational actor, things will get more stable. But as we have seen, we can't really trust that. And we don't feel safe with the existing nuclear weapon states either. I mean, at least I don't have much trust at the moment in President Putin's sense of judgment, although that's probably part of the strategy to make the deterrence even more effective. Yeah, that was my attempt to respond to this difficult question.
Dr. Rouhi?
If I may actually offer a comment on this question before answering your two other questions. And I'm going to make the argument of those within the Iranian political establishment or else experts who make an argument for having a nuclear weapon. And so I don't believe that there is a belief that they're worth nothing. I actually disagree with that. I think they see a utility, and they see utility in two ways. If the world was very different and there were no costs and consequences, and I'm not just talking about the sanctions, diplomatically, relations with other countries in the world, your status, etc. If none of that existed, the utility of nuclear weapons for Iran, even though they would not use it in their neighborhood, obviously, would be exactly to have a freer hand with their other. So I disagree with you, Tuti, in terms of like whether that would limit their ability to do more in the region with their non-state actors and missiles. I think their view it that this would actually give them more immunity to be able to operate in the region without being under the threat or the risk of a Israeli strike, right? So I think it's worth considering. I don't agree. I'm a non-proliferation person at heart. I don't like nuclear weapons. I don't believe they're good. But in terms of what the thinking is and the utility, it is there. And so I think that's sort of undeniable to think that they're worth nothing, because that's not how it's viewed in Iran, at least. Once they put in the context and the cost of it sort of adds up, and I don't think that they do believe that if they do so, then Saudi Arabia or UAE, they really do not take that very seriously. They do not. There's not such a belief that, because as you know, as we all know, there's a lot of technology, a lot of different sort of things involved in the ability part of it that the Iranians just do not think that the Saudis will have. So that's, again, my view on that part. But going back to the question, so sanctions is one of the main projects, and it has been for the past few years. So my response to that would be, there is no such a thing as the sanctions regime being lifted on Iran. I mean, it is very naive to even think that, and Iranians have learned that the hard way post the JCPOA. And I think everyone in the world learned that the hard way, that the unfortunate truth about the sanctions is that you can control signing a paper saying they're lifted. You cannot control the corporate world to think that Iran is now safe for investment or deals are safe to be made. You cannot make the banks to do the transaction saying the sanction is lifted, do some transactions with us. It just does not work that way. So I don't see in the foreseeable future, particularly that non-nuclear sanctions are also hugely extensive, that in the 10 years we are thinking about an Iran which is not under sanctions. However, to your point about having the world powers coming together and having the same kind of unity that existed in 2012 to impose those kinds of sanctions, I think if you had asked me this question prior to Russia's invasion, I would have said, there is still a possibility. It wouldn't be as easy. It wouldn't be the same. But there is a non-proliferation interest that would trump that. However, the sanctions against Russia right now and how they will play out in the future might create a different incentive for the world financial system, and that would play out very differently. And I have no way of predicting how that would work out. If that creates a scenario where circumventing sanctions or having deals with certain other countries much easier than it was, because right now it's just not Iran against the world, it's Iran and Russia against the world, then that would be a very different scenario. But I can't comment on that. But I can comment is that it's not just the US's non-proliferation interest, and it's not even about China and Russia. China and Russia, Iran is one player they're dealing with. They have just as important, if not more important, relationships with other countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc., who have a strong incentive and interest in Iran not developing a nuclear weapon, right? So it's not just US going around convincing everybody, let's sanction Iran. It's really others pushing this forward. And I think that's what has made the sanctions very difficult for Iran, because there are different components to it and people pushing for it. So given that there would be no scenario in which the sanctions are completely lifted, and I don't even think it would be 5 years, because in Iran's calculation, this is just going to be for 2 years, and then there will be a next president in the US, or regardless of that, there will be enough political pushback domestically in the US that the deal will just be shaky at best. So that prospect is just not there, and so I'm not going to comment on that. But again, that will affect what kind of sanctions regime will be against them. Would be very, I think, influential in them making a decision what to do at that point. And I will add this, that they might actually, and I'm worried about them feeling that this whole situation in the world might be their opportunity to do what they've been waiting for. And that's a real sort of thought that exists and could very much sort of pick up. And that get me to your second question, which relates to that. And I have to be very careful here, because you asked me about whether I think US will do that or not. So I have to again give the disclaimer that this is my personal view. The way I think such scenario will play out is that, and I understand, and this is exactly what many in Tehran sitting at Supreme National Security Council would be thinking, that look, like the US just cannot afford another war. But the reality is there is a difference, or there's a differentiation, at least the idea in Israel and US is that we don't have to have a war. We just hit main bases and their Air Force bases, and that's it. We'll just conduct a limited military strike, and this will be over with. And the reason why I think that's a real or serious possibility is that I think if Israel initiates such strike, I think the US will follow through, will support them, will not stay out of it. And that's how Iranians exactly think. They always think the threat of the Israeli attack as an extension of the US, because in their view, the Israelis will not do such a thing without US green light. So it is a real threat. Again, I have to add this caveat to that. All that Iranians have been doing in terms of their sort of deterrent with the non-state actors is that to remove that option of limited military strike. They've always tried to signal that there cannot be such a thing as limited military strike, and that if there is, we will escalate it to a full-blown war. And that has been their strategy. How successful that has been in shaping decisions in Israel and US, I don't know, but I still think it's a real possibility that there will be military strikes.